Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos pela vossa presença nesta segunda estreia, ou melhor, estreia da segunda série da Tertúlia Diplomática. A Tertúlia Diplomática foi um formato que eu animei durante alguns anos numa livraria, a livraria Feria, no Chiado, e que é um formato curto, é um formato de 1 hora, com a presença de um embaixador, que nos vem falar de um tema que é acordado, um tema histórico, um tema político, um tema das relações entre os dois países, um tema da política regional do ponto de vista internacional, que esteja na atualidade, e depois, como era na livraria, no final apresentavam um livro. Agora, não necessariamente. Hoje temos connosco a senhora Embaixadora das Filipinas, temos aqui também presente o embaixador da Indonésia, l'ambassadeur de Côte d'Ivoire, que eu saúdo, e a senhora embaixadora das Filipinas, Celia Feria, está já em Portugal há alguns anos, há 5 anos. Eu travei conhecimento com ela no princípio das minhas funções aqui, através de um amigo comum, que eu espero que apareça na sessão de hoje, senão tem uma falta grave. Enfim, nessa conversa falou-nos do Fernando Magalhães. Nós estávamos no início da comemoração do 5º centenário. E, enfim, as Filipinas têm uma grande admiração por Fernando Magalhães, ainda que nós falemos das Filipinas porque ele morreu lá. E, portanto, isso é um assunto que cria alguma confusão e perturbação. E, neste último ano do 5º centenário da viagem de circunnavegação, que acabou em Sevilha em 1522, nós achámos que era adequado trazer aqui a senhora embaixadora para nos falar deste tema. Nós temos relações muito antigas com as Filipinas, temos, infelizmente, relações diplomáticas a meio gás, foram interrompidas a certa altura, e depois houve um acordo para as restabelecer, mas só as Filipinas é que as cumpriram. Há 8 anos, talvez, ou mais, que as Filipinas voltaram a ter um embaixador em Lisboa. Uma embaixadora. Foi a primeira embaixadora, não sei se depois pelo meio houve algum embaixador, mas um embaixador. Então, pronto, já é o terceiro embaixador da retoma das relações diplomáticas e nós continuamos sem abrir uma embaixada em Manila, o que é uma grande omissão, porque as relações, no meu entender, as relações de Portugal com o Oriente são muito importantes. Nós temos um prestígio que nos surpreende e um carinho que nos surpreende e, portanto, devemos cultivar, e isso faz, como é regra da diplomacia, na base bilateral. E, portanto, eu espero que nós possamos, em breve, voltar a abrir a nossa embaixada em Manila, como é desejado. Mas, enfim, não é para me ouvirem que aqui estão, e, portanto, eu passo a palavra à senhora embaixadora. A senhora embaixadora vai falar em inglês. Esperamos que a maioria das pessoas, ou a totalidade, fale inglês. Havendo alguma dificuldade, pode-se fazer uma pequena tradução rápida, mas isso é o que permite manter o ritmo da reunião, que é fundamental. E também é indispensável que quem fala esteja completamente à vontade com o que está a fazer. Isso é essencial à comunicação e, portanto, essa será também as regras hoje, como aconteceu uma outra vez nas sessões da Tertúlia Diplomática na livraria Feria. Houve alguns casos em que as pessoas falavam em inglês, em 2 casos, e em espanhol, num outro caso. Senhora Embaixadora, tem a palavra. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Dr. José Ribeiro e Castro. Peço desculpas, porque para falar 30 minutos, acho que não chegamos ao português. Com 5 minutos dá para falar em português, mas acho que mais disso, melhor falar em inglês. Então, é uma honra estar aqui na Sociedade Histórica da Independência de Portugal e agradeço ao Sr. José Ribeiro e Castro pela invitação para falar hoje. I've been the Philippine ambassador to Portugal for the past 5 years, and living in Lisbon, many of you will agree that walking the streets of Lisbon and other cities and towns in Portugal is like a never-ending history lesson. For us Filipinos, being in Portugal is like discovering a long-lost relative and finding out that in spite of the distance and the diversion in history, the Philippines and the Filipinos actually have so much in common with Portugal and the Portuguese. So what are these? Our people have been and are Catholics for centuries. We were both ruled by the same king for a time, Philip I for Spain and Philip I for Portugal. It was after Philip II that the Spanish explorer Ruy Lopez de Villalobos named the islands the Philippines, or Filipinas, in 1453. And we, like you, like porco preto and bacalhau and sardines and torresmos. So in fact, in the 1960s, there was a sardine brand that was very famous in the Philippines. And this brand was called Mabuti. It was a Filipino name, which is manufactured by the 100-year-old sardine factory in Matosinhos called Piñais y Compañía. So when I was first asked by Dr. Jose Ribeiro y Castro to speak in the Diplomatic Tertúlia activity, which he's reviving, I nervously accepted. I knew I could not turn down such an honor and opportunity to speak about the Philippines, if only to make the Portuguese more aware about the Philippines. So here I am, still nervous, ainda nervosa, mas muy honrada and very delighted to be here. So I was given a wide array of options and topics to speak on, but I decided to speak on those that I knew best, considering my position. And this is about the Philippines and Portuguese relations. And so I think it's a perfect time to speak about this relation since the Secretary of State for Internationalization, Bernardo Ivo Cruz, happens to be in Manila now for an ADB meeting, the Asian Development Bank meeting. But while he is in Manila, we have taken the opportunity for him to meet with key government and business leaders to discuss more trade relations between our two countries and for him to learn firsthand about the situation in the Philippines. I also just spoke today to the Portuguese ambassador in Jakarta, who is accredited to the Philippines, Maria Joao Lopez Cardoso, who is very excited at being in the Philippines because she is accompanying the Secretary of State. And her initial feedback has been very positive, which gives me a lot of confidence in working together with the team in Jakarta to bring our relationship to another level. So at this point, allow me to begin with some general information about the relations between Portugal and the Philippines. Basically, on July 4, 1946, the Philippines obtained its independence from the United States of America. It's what you would call our second independence, because previously, on June 12, 1898, the Philippines had declared independence from Spain after 333 years of being a colony. But it was short-lived independence. As a result of the American victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its remaining colonies, which included the Philippines, to America. So we therefore became part of the American Commonwealth. A common idiomatic expression to summarize our history was coined by a famous Filipino journalist, the late Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, and it is 300 years in the convent, 50 years in Hollywood. So this pretty much summarizes our history in 9 words. Our independence in 1946 was a culmination of a process that began in 1916 and which provided for a 10-year transitional period to prepare for our independence. I wish to note here that a year before we got our independence in 1946, we had already joined the United Nations in June of 1945 as one of its founding members. There were 51 founding member states, while we were still known as the Philippine Commonwealth. As sort of reference, Portugal joined the UN 10 years later in 1955. So in July of 1946 marked the start of the Third Republic. So it was inaugurated, we inaugurated President Manuel Rojas, and the whole world sent its representatives to the inauguration of the newest country in town. Portugal sent the governor of Macau, Gabriel Mauricio Teixeira, to the inauguration of President Rojas, and therefore started the formal recognition of the Philippines by Portugal. However, as far back as 1511, when Alfonso de Albuquerque colonized Malacca for Portugal, there were already historical evidences that there were the first Filipinos from the island of Luzon had already begun trading with the Portuguese. Thus, they became the first contacts between Portugal and the future Filipinos from the island of Luzon. But I'm getting ahead of my story here, so let's go back to Philippine-Portugal relations. As Dr. Ribeiro y Castro mentioned, at the moment, Portugal has no embassy in Manila, so we are covered by the Portuguese embassy in Jakarta. And it's our hope, as yours is, that they reopen the embassy soon. There are some 1,726 Filipinos residing in Portugal. But although Portugal is not a major destination for Filipino migrants, as let's say the United Kingdom is, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, there are most of the Filipinos who came to Portugal were brought by their Portuguese employers from Macau after the turnover to China in 1999. And there are also a number of Filipinos married to Portuguese and other nationals who reside here in Portugal. We also have the religious nuns in Fatima, and now we have students, and lately more tech people from the Philippines working in tech firms established in Portugal. We also have a number of golden visa investors, including a big Filipino investment in Paredes, which employs 300 Portuguese workers. Soon, we hope to have a formal channel wherein qualified Filipino hotel and hospitality workers can come to Portugal to work in your tourism sector, and I guarantee that it will be a very synergetic working relationship, as Filipinos are very well known to work in the hotel industry. In terms of trade, traditionally, Philippine exports more to Portugal than Portugal sells to the Philippines, although the Portuguese has been very actively promoting and following up approval for the export of Portuguese pork and pork products to the Philippines. So hopefully soon we will have more porco preto and torresmos in our supermarkets because we love pork in the Philippines. In 2021, our total trade totaled $45 million US. It's not much. 30 million was our exports to Portugal, and 15 million was what we bought from Portugal. So what did we sell? We sold things that we had to Google them to send you pictures, to show you pictures of what they actually are. Our top 5 exports are electrical and electronic machinery equipments and parts, printed circuits, digital monolithic integrated circuits, tunas. We actually sell bonito atún to Portugal, and tires, pneumatic tires. So what did we buy from Portugal? We bought some medicaments, overhead traveling cranes. Those are the ones that you see in the ports that carry the containers. So we buy that from you. We also buy yeast. So I think we make a lot of bread in the Philippines. We buy t-shirts, clothing, and other parts of machinery. So in terms of investment, as I mentioned earlier, there is a Filipino-owned garment manufacturing company in Paredes, close to Porto, that employs 300 Portuguese workers. The company is called NSD Apparel, and they manufacture high-end garments for the international market, and we are very proud of them. They were established in Portugal in 2014. The owners are a young Filipino couple who decided to expand their business to Portugal. They have factories in China and in the Philippines, and they since moved one of their factories to Portugal. So as ambassador, I have the exclusive bragging rights that a Philippine-owned company employs or gives employment to 300 Portuguese workers. And so in terms of trade and investment, there's really much more that we can do, and I'm hoping that the visit of the Secretary of State to Manila will open more doors for more possibilities for Portuguese and Philippine trade. Now, what do we have in common with Portugal? Moving to the macro picture in our relations, allow me to summarize some key commonalities between our countries. And by this, I mean the overall scheme of our bilateral relations. One, Portugal, like the Philippines, is a migrant-sending country. Philippines has some 10 million Filipinos living abroad. Over 2 million of them are labor migrants. Philippines and Portugal adhere to the rule of law, both domestic and international. We both work together to preserve our oceans and advocate the sustainable use of the oceans. We are both committed to Universal Human Rights Convention. The Philippines is signatory to 8 of the major human rights convention and its optional protocols. Together, we promote maritime cooperation. At any given time, there are 225 Filipino seamen on board merchant ships, sailing the seas. So we are grateful to the Portuguese Navy Rescue Center for coming to the aid of our seafarers who have been seriously sick or injured while their ships are in the waters under Portugal's area of responsibility. Both Philippines and Portugal adhere to free trade, and we look forward to Portugal's support to our pending free trade agreement with the EU, which is going on its 3rd round of negotiations. Both our countries attach great importance to gender and women issues. Similar to Portugal, Philippines champions women's rights, both at home and abroad. The very first working draft of the CEDAW, which is a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, also known as the Bill of Rights of Women, was actually drafted by a Filipina diplomat. We also work together for climate change mitigation. Both our nations are affected by the ravages of climate change. Both El Niño and La Niña phenomena continue to bring drastic changes to our traditional lifestyles. Droughts and floods have created havoc in our nations. But more than Portugal, the Philippines gets the short end of the stick when it comes to devastation caused by climate change. There are an average of 20 tropical cyclones that hit our region yearly, and half of that enter the Philippines' area of responsibility through the Pacific Ocean side of the country. This usually happens during the months of July and October, so this is the perfect time for a tropical cyclone. And of course, we have an enduring friendship anchored in historical ties, the Christian faith, and the commitment to democratic principles. So briefly, we've also signed agreements with Portugal. We have bilateral cooperation in tourism, a cultural agreement, more mutual protection of investments, recognition of STCW seafarer certificates. We also have a social security agreement that allows for the export of benefits and totalization of contributions for Portuguese and Filipinos who work in who have social security contributions. We also have an MOU and bilateral consultation mechanism and a cooperation and diplomatic training and exchange of information. And we actually have 2 more agreements in the pipeline. Next slide. Briefly, it's just a comparative data between the Philippines and Portugal. We have a comparative data on our GDP, but you must understand that we are 10 times more than Portugal. Our land area is about 3 times more than Portugal. We have 7,641 islands, and you have 27. Our population is 109 million, and yours is 10, so that's 10 times more. And we have an exclusive economic zone of about 2.2 million square kilometers, and Portugal's is about 1.7 million square kilometers. We have 187 languages. You have 4. Now, next slide. We recently had national elections in May this year, where we directly elected the president, the vice president, 12 members of Congress, 12 members of the Senate, 1 member of the Congress, and various municipal officials. Like Portugal, we also have the overseas absentee voting. Now, President Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr. was overwhelmingly voted by Filipinos, both at home and abroad. This is the 3rd time in our history that a child of a former president was elected president. The first one was Diosdado Macapagal, his daughter, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. The second one was Corazon Aquino and her only son, Benigno Aquino III. And now, President Ferdinand Marcos and his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So in his recent address Last week at the UN General Assembly, the President reaffirmed certain priorities of the government, which also reflects our commonalities with Portugal. So again, he spoke about the importance of the rule of law, the Philippines' commitment to the ideals of the United Nations. He spoke of the need to uphold justice, respect human rights, and maintain international peace and security. He also mentioned the need to bounce back from the economic stupor caused by the pandemic, and that there was a need to resolve challenges facing the international community, such as climate change, development of advanced technology, widening geopolitical polarities, and persistent inequalities within and among nations. And summarizing the President's independent foreign policy, the Philippines shall continue to be a friend to all and an enemy to none. So, from last week's event, let's jump back a little further into history to events that happened 501 years ago and how it involves the Philippines and Portugal. Just get a glass of water. In December 2019, the Philippine Embassy organized a conference in the nearby Sociedad de Geografía on Fernando Magalhães, or Ferdinand Magellan, as he is known to the Filipinos. It was a time when both the Philippines and Portugal were beginning to organize parallel activities with the 5th centennial of the circumnavigation of the world by the Magellan-Elcano expedition. But in the Philippines, the commemorations were about the 500 years of the victory in Mactan. Victory and humanity. Same story, different points of view. The title of the conference in December tells us a story. He was the Portuguese explorer, Fernando Magalhães. He sailed for Spain, so his name was Fernando de Magallanes. And years later, as Philippine history books are always written in English, we know him in the Philippines as Ferdinand Magellan. That conference was a first for us because we had wanted to bring the Philippine perspective about Magalhães. So we invited 5 of the top Philippine historians to shed light on Magalhães from the point of view of Philippine history. Now, the main message of the Philippine narratives of our commemoration centers on the hospitality and generosity of our ancestors who extended help to the weary, the sick, and the dying members of the Magellan expedition from the time they arrived in the Philippines, or what's now known as the Philippines, on March 16, 1521. They arrived in the island of Suluan in what is now known as Samar. They were all undernourished, starving, weary, dying, sick from the long voyage over the Pacific Ocean, 3 months over the Pacific Ocean. And when they arrived, it was a week after leaving what they considered the inhospitable islands of Guam. Our ancestors then showed them no hostility and instead offered them food, water, and freedom to throw anchor in any of the islands that they passed. Our same ancestors were on March 31st, 2 weeks after arriving in Suluan, also introduced to a Catholic Mass. And on 14 April, the King of Cebu and his family and 800 of his people were even baptized at the request of Fernando Magalhães, where he gifted the wife of the King of Cebu with the image of the Santo Niño or the Menino Jesus. The Filipinos' fervent veneration to the Santo Niño is considered by many to this day as the most popular and enduring legacy of the Magellan expedition to the Philippines. So, how did events turn bloody, resulting in the death of Magalhães and 8 of his men 2 weeks later on 27 April 1521? I'm an amateur historian, but I read books. And this much I can add to the narrative. I think Magalhães' lack of understanding of the political and social dynamics in the islands of Cebu and Mactan, which were ruled by independent chieftains or rajas, led him to making the wrong tactical and strategic decisions when dealing with Raja Lapu-Lapu, his arch-enemy. It makes one think that had he landed in Mactan before he landed in Cebu, could he and Lapu-Lapu instead have been allies? And then another theory, if I can add, again being an amateur historian here, as I mentioned earlier, the Philippines is normally hit by 10 tropical cyclones every year, including this time of the year. We have weather disturbances that originate from the Pacific Ocean, the same ocean traversed by the Magellan expedition for 3 months before arriving in Suluan in March. So my question and what's going through my mind is, what if they arrive during the typhoon season? Would they have even landed in the Philippines at all? Now, the Magellan-Elcano voyage was an epic voyage, which began in Spain in 1519 and ended in Spain also in 1522. And the primary aim of this voyage was to find an alternative route to the Spice Islands. This was what brought Magallanes and his expedition to the Philippines, in what would have been a precursor voyage leading to the beginning of Spanish colonization in 1565. So again, what they found in the islands were a people who were already living in a developed society, trading within the region with Chinese and Arab and even Portuguese traders. As the latter, the Portuguese were already in Asia long before the Spanish expedition to our part of the world. However one looks at it, this particular voyage was one of major importance to the Philippines for the following reason. While sailing for Spain, the expedition was the first documented arrival of Europeans in the islands we now call the Philippines. Antonio de Pigafetta, the chronicler of the Magallanes expedition, Francisco Albo, the pilot of the ship Victoria, and Ginés de Mafra, crew member of the Magallanes expedition, among others, wrote important entries in their diaries and logbooks, and their first-hand accounts that were the ones that documented the arrival of the first Europeans in the islands we now call the Philippines. Now, Magallanes introduced Christianity to the inhabitants of the islands since his arrival in our part of the world on March 16. He held masses in the islands of Limasawa, and a month later in the island of Cebu, where he also organized the first baptism of the king of Cebu, Raja Humabon, and his wife, along with 800 other convertees. Now, it may not have been a full conversion, since there was no substantial time for Magallanes to teach in depth the doctrines of Christianity, given it was just a few days. And Magallanes was aware of this. Yet, his act of proselytizing in just a few days, where he converted communities in the island of Cebu to Christianity, left a lasting legacy in the island of Cebu. Now, Magallanes gifted the wife of Raja Humabon, who was baptized with the name Queen Juana, with the image of the Santo Niño, or the Menino Jesus. This is Magallanes' most lasting legacy in the Philippines, as the devotion to the Santo Niño of Cebu, as the image is known, is prominent not only in Cebu, but in the entire Philippines. Indeed, this voyage through Magallanes planted the seeds of Christianity in the Philippines. It is also in this part of the voyage that Magallanes is killed, when he involved himself in the local politics involving the warring rajas of the neighboring islands of Cebu and Mactan. The Filipinos see Magallanes' death as a symbol of the triumph of our ancestors over a foreign power. So Raja Lapu-Lapu, Magallanes' arch-enemy in the story, refused to be baptized and refused to swear allegiance to the Spanish king, as did the other Rajas that Magellan had met since he arrived in the islands. Perhaps angered and frustrated by the refusal of Lapu-Lapu to go along with his planned evangelization, Magallanes, ordered the burning of a hamlet in Mactan, a little community, as it was the only community that Magallanes was not successful in converting to Christianity, nor was he able to convince Lapu-Lapu. In short, Magallanes challenged Lapu-Lapu to a battle, one which everyone except Magallanes knew he would lose. So the battle took place at a time of the day when it was low tide, causing his ships to be very far away from the beach and therefore not within reach of the cannons and other military artillery that was on the ships. So Magellan and his men, some 40 of them, had to walk from the longboats. You know, you get out of the ships, you go to the longboats, and they would sail to the beach, towards the beach. But they had to walk from the longboats to the shore completely unprotected. And when the battle began, Lapu-Lapu, the chieftain of Mactan, unleashed hundreds of men with bows and arrows and bamboo spears. And these men included those whose homes Magellan had ordered burned earlier. So there was anger with the people. So I think it must have been his hubris or the belief that it was God's will for him to continue converting the natives to Christianity, which, by the way, was not part of the instructions of King Carlos V. I think this must have what caused Magellan to err on the side of his combat tactic and strategy. He was outmaneuvered and outsmarted by Lapu-Lapu, something Magellan did not or could not envisage to end his life and that of his mission. Now, Magellan's death in the Philippines is part of the Philippine narrative within a bigger story of the circumnavigation. Until the time he is killed in Mactan, it was the Magellan expedition. Elcano's role in the circumnavigation starts 6 months after Magellan's death in Mactan, when the remaining 2 ships, the Victoria and the Trinidad, find their way finally to the Moluccas and are loaded up with the spices, which is what they came for. Fast forward again to today. Since 2017, we at the Philippine Embassy have sought ways to promote the Philippines and Portugal. A big breakthrough came when we had this 500 years of the circumnavigation, and we had met with the head of the Estructura de Missão, do Quinto Centenário da Primeira Viagem de Circumnavigação. So the embassy began to participate in all these activities in time for the big celebration here in Portugal in 2021. That same year, we were very lucky to have met a group of very distinguished and enthusiastic Portuguese historians specializing in Asia from the Centro de Humanidades of the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. Since then, we've been collaborating with them in a wide range of historical and cultural activities that began to see fruition in 2019 until today. Between the participation of the embassy in the many activities headed by the Estructura de Missão in Portugal and the wide range of historical and cultural activities that we, the embassy, organize, we were able to relay to the Portuguese audience the Philippine narratives within this bigger story of the first circumnavigation of the world. One way of preserving these narratives and to highlight the role that the Philippines played in this bigger story was to come up with research activities with the Universidade Nova de Lisboa historians who helped us come up with pioneering research highlighting the Portuguese perspective in our history. So we have 3 legacy projects: the Philippines in Portuguese History and Historiography, which is a research publication aimed at identifying Portuguese archives, incorporated in the highest number of documents pertaining to Philippines. Then there's another book called The Islands Beyond the Empire, which is a collection of essays on the history of the Portuguese relations with the Philippines during the 16th and the 18th century. Then we have the Bibliography of the Philippines in Portuguese Archives, entitled Documenta Filipina, the Philippines in Portuguese Archives. So it's a publication aimed to locate and identify historical materials relevant to the history of the Philippines in Portuguese archives and library. So these 3 legacy projects is a first attempt at systematizing the work on retrieving Portuguese archival materials and documents and essays on the Philippines. These are our narratives written from the Portuguese perspective. Now, these materials and documentations are being brought out for the first time to benefit Filipino and other end users who are historians, members of the academies, students of history, among others. But our collaboration with SHAM doesn't end there. We have more activities, more publications. We have a new project entitled The Philippines in Portuguese Cartography, 16th and 18th century. We have the early news about the Philippines in the 16th century Europe. And then we have one called The Philippines, a Global Contact Zone in Early Modern Era. Now, lastly, this is probably what we're very dear to our hearts, is we will soon be publishing the first ever Portuguese edition of Dr. Jose Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. Now, Jose Rizal is our national hero, and his role in our culture, history, and literature have yet to be discovered by the Portuguese-speaking community. To date, there are no Portuguese translations of his novels, leaving his legacy and his literary and historical contributions largely unknown to the Portuguese-speaking community. So I'm delighted to share that Penguin Random House editorial group has expressed great interest in publishing this first ever Portuguese translation of the Noli Me Tangere, and they have agreed to publish this Filipino novel under their collection of the Penguin Portuguese Classics. So I believe that the translation into Portuguese of this very seminal novel will greatly impact the value of Philippine history, culture, and literature in Portugal and in the rest of the Portuguese-speaking world. Now, before I end, and as part of the Tertúlia tradition, I wish to present, where is it? It's here. I wish to present this book to our host, Dr. Jose Ribeiro y Castro. Now, this book is very special. It was written by the foremost authority on Fernão de Magalhães in the Philippines. His name is Dr. Danilo Herona, and I have a little card here written for you. And it's an autographed copy of the book. So we are lucky to call Dr. Herona our friend. He has participated in several of our conferences organized by the Philippine Embassy regarding Magalhães commemorations. And his book is a labor of love, as most books written by historians are. He is truly passionate about this topic and has used many primary sources in researching the book. And so I hope you enjoy reading it as much as we enjoy giving it to you and having the honor to give that book to you. And with that, I end. I say thank you and muito obrigada e boa tarde.
Muito obrigado, Sra. Embaixadora. Foi uma apresentação muito completa, muito variada e muito interessante, porque para mim, e creio que para toda a gente aqui na sala, quase toda a gente, conseguimos ouvir de uma forma mais completa a história que rodeou a morte de Fernão de Magalhães, que é sempre referida de uma forma muito breve, não é? E que eu creio que, enfim, obviamente lamentemos a morte de Fernão de Magalhães, deve ser essa morte que um momento importante da viagem é a sua passagem pelas Filipinas. Se não se passasse nada, não se passaria nada. É curioso que na viagem de circunnavegação há dois momentos que são referidos: a travessia do sul do continente americano, portanto aquele canal a seguir, salvo erro, ao Cabo das Virgens, no sul da Argentina, e depois a saída para o Pacífico no Chile, é um episódio muito marcado, e depois as Filipinas, não é? As Filipinas. Além de, porque ele morreu nas Filipinas, depois as Molucas, porque é a passagem nas Molucas que faz com que ele tenha feito a primeira volta ao mundo, somando uma viagem anterior com o percurso feito até aí. E, portanto, isso é muito interessante. Como também, enfim, é interessante as notícias que a senhora Embaixadora nos traz, da forma como olham para Portugal e o legado que esta presença de um português, Magalhães, e os seus companheiros deixou nas Filipinas e que é cultivado até hoje. Portanto, por isso, é um facto que nos causa reconhecimento e também gratidão e espanto, porque, de facto, havendo apenas 200 portugueses nas Filipinas, como podemos ver, Se não fosse a admiração histórica que as Filipinas têm por Portugal, ninguém saberia quem nós somos, a não ser talvez o Cristiano Ronaldo. E, portanto, e antes o Luís Figo, e antes talvez o Eusébio, esses grandes artistas do futebol. Mas foi uma exposição, muito obrigado, e muito obrigado também pelo livro que me deixa, que eu lerei com todo o interesse. Eu queria perguntar se alguém tem uma observação, uma questão a colocar à senhora Embaixadora, nos minutos que ainda temos. Não? Bom, então pergunto eu. A senhora Embaixadora disse-me que o senhor Secretário de Estado da Internacionalização, Bernardo Cruz, está lá nesta altura. Há algum desenvolvimento da questão diplomática, de abertura de uma embaixada, ou está tudo? Que sinais é que tem? Eu creio que gostava de saber se esse é um assunto que tem continuidade nas discussões políticas entre o governo das Filipinas e o governo de Portugal, ou é um assunto remoto?
Sempre faço a representação diante das autoridades portuguesas para reabrir a embaixada em Filipinas. Entendemos que é um assunto também de orçamento.
Sim.
Mas sempre diz que nas Filipinas vocês podem vender mais coisas para sustentar a abertura da embaixada. Imagina que temos 10 vezes mais a população das Filipinas que Portugal. Vocês podem vender qualquer coisa. Então, a ideia, eu falei com
Porco preto, torresmos.
Porco preto, torresmos, sardinhas, tudo. Mas o secretário de Estado para a Internacionalização está aí para participar numa conferência da Asian Development Bank, porque Portugal é uma das governadoras do Asian Development Bank. Mas é muito interessante porque estou falando com minha amiga embaixadora de Portugal em Jakarta, que é também embaixadora nas Filipinas, e eu disse, ela tem que falar com as pessoas importantes nas Filipinas, os líderes de negócios e do governo, e elas vai dizer à secretária de Estado que Portugal elas vai tentar convencer a secretária de Estado para reabrir a embaixada, e acho que seria uma boa ideia para Portugal reabrir aquela embaixada, porque tem muitas coisas que eles podem vender e fazer nas Filipinas.
Bom, outra pergunta que eu queria fazer nas relações universitárias.
Sim.
Porque eu uma vez vi uma notícia, salvo erro, da filha de um homem muito rico das Filipinas que esteve aqui a estudar e fez um doutoramento, um mestrado na Universidade Nova, salvo erro, com o professor Armando Marques Guedes. Não conhece essa pessoa?
Sim, eu conheço o Sr. Marcos Guedes, mas não sei exatamente quem é, mas não me surpreende muito, porque agora Portugal está sendo descoberto pelos estudantes filipinos também, porque aqui vocês têm universidades de alto nível, e ajuda muito que aqui podem falar em inglês, porque a chegar aqui é um pouco difícil falar em português. Eu tinha que estudar ou praticar 5 anos até este nível de português que posso falar. Mas sim, outra coisa que temos que descobrir aqui em Portugal é as universidades. São muito bem aqui e tem possibilidade de aumentar os números de alunos filipinos que estão aqui agora em Portugal.
Alguma pergunta? Não, eu não tenho mais questões a colocar. Eu queria apenas agradecer à senhora Embaixadora a sua gentileza.
Sou eu que agradecer.
Eu vi ali o seu artigo de 2021, que eu li na altura, mas nós circularemos também entre os nossos sócios e que tenho aqui também uns livros para lhe oferecer. Este é um livro, vai ficar desatualizado quando o Palácio for para obras, mas é um livro feito por Jorge Pereira de Sampaio, que é de Alcobaça, dos museus da cultura antiga. Isto é um livro de Manuel Rodrigues com os uniformes militares, é um livro muito interessante, e este é a nossa última edição, é um livro do engenheiro Roberto Carneiro, que foi Ministro da Educação, que é de origem macaense, de Xangai, e que escreveu um ensaio muito interessante, Identidade Nacional, sobre a nossa língua. E este livro estreou a nossa coleção de ensaios, esperemos que haja o segundo, este foi o primeiro, e ganhou o prémio. Enfim, essa comunicação foi feita quando foi atribuído ao Engenheiro Roberto Carneiro o prémio Sandro Lemos, que é o prémio mais importante da sociedade histórica, que distingue as pessoas, os seus contributos para a identidade portuguesa. Foi o prémio que ele ganhou em 2018, salvo erro, e depois escreveu esse livro que deu lugar a uma apresentação própria.
Então, em nome da Embaixadora das Filipinas aqui, aceito esses livros e que vai formar parte da nossa biblioteca, livraria na Embaixada, biblioteca na Embaixada, e que eu acho que a partir da manhã eu vou falar com os dois cônsules que estão aqui, que têm que começar a ler estes livros. Muito obrigada, muito obrigada.
Muito obrigado. Sim, senhor.
Thank you.